We always appreciate having you with us here at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. As Scott has mentioned, and our other speakers have mentioned this morning, we have a very crucial election. We're all well aware of that coming up. There have been concerns that have been raised about potential vote fraud, potential difficulty in counting ballots with the expansion of mail-in voting, and other difficulties here in Pennsylvania. Our rogue Pennsylvania State Supreme Court decided to rewrite legislation rather than interpret the law and change the rules for the counting of ballots. Over the years, John Fund has been a good friend to the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. He has written a number of books on election security and certainly is in great demand today, as that is a very important issue. John currently is the national affairs columnist for National Review. You may recall for many years he was on the board of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. And we are pleased to welcome, I believe from New York State, where John is at the moment, John Fund. Welcome.
Thank you, Lohman. And I cannot tell you how important a time that you have to hold this conference. We're only about 35 days or so before the election, and it's a very unusual election. For a variety of reasons, the entire election process has been upended, as Congressman Perry indicated. We used to have Election Day, and it worked pretty well. But for a variety of reasons, and I think some of it is understandable, convenience voting issues in a busy time for most people's lives, we've gradually expanded the opportunities for early voting and absentee voting. For most of those, I have no problem whatsoever. But this year is different because we have seen that under the cover of the COVID virus crisis, there's been a wholesale attempt to not just dramatically expand mail-in voting and absentee voting in a very short period of time, such a short period of time it's taxing the ability of our election officials to handle it, but we've also seen a deliberate attempt to obliterate the safeguards and the procedures that protect against fraud in an election. We now have, and certainly in Pennsylvania, election month before the election. We have people voting absentee even earlier than before. We have early voting. This is all new. And there are dramatic changes, as Lohman indicates, regarding the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's recent decision, and I'll get to those. So we now have election month before the election, and that creates conditions so that after we have the actual election day, we're going to have an election month in which a lot of these issues are going to have to be litigated. There will be recounts, there will be arguments in court, and they may go all the way up to the Supreme Court, as they did in 2000 in the Bush v. Gore race involving Florida. Now, you're going to hear an awful lot about the reasons for these changes. You're going to hear that this is to prevent voter suppression. This is to make sure people aren't disenfranchised. This is to make sure that there aren't people deprived of their right to vote. Well, let me stipulate one thing. Everyone who's listening to me right now has two civil rights when it comes to elections. Two. The first right is the right to cast their ballot free of fear and intimidation, not to have arbitrary barriers put up like poll taxes or literacy tests or other impediments. And much of the American South had those barriers up until the 1960s. It's why we fought a great civil rights struggle in the 1960s to pass the Voting Rights Act. And we have to preserve and protect those gains. And I'm glad that we have those new procedures. But every one of the people listening to this broadcast also has another civil right, and that's the right not to have your vote canceled out by someone who shouldn't be voting. Someone who's dead. By the way, I like to say that that position didn't used to be controversial. That position was called no representation without respiration. And I believe that if you have people who are dead, who have moved out of state, who have been felons and have not completed the terms of their parole or their probation, if you have people who literally have been invented, who are not citizens in this country, you are basically canceling out someone's vote and invalidating it just as much as if you stood in a poll house door and prevented someone from voting. So we need to preserve both civil rights. the right to vote and the right to not have your vote canceled out illegally. Now, we used to have a bipartisan consensus on this. In 2002, I reported a lot on the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in the wake of the 2000 Bush v. Gore recount. And that was a bipartisan piece of legislation. The Democratic co-sponsor in the Senate was Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut. And he said famously, we can make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We're America. We can do both. And that was the consensus that applied in much of the political community. In 2005, there was a presidential commission to look at our election procedures in all 50 states. It was co-chaired by former President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and by former Secretary of State James Baker, a Republican. And they concluded by a vote of 18-3 that the country should have a voter ID system. It should have people show their voter ID if they show up at the polls to prove who they say they are. They also issued a warning in their report that the one vulnerability that was clearly obvious in their study was mail-in voting. That mail-in voting was fraught with peril because it is conducted outside the view and the supervision of government officials. The ballot is just out there. Let's just think about some of the things that can happen to these ballots. Well, they can get lost. We've seen that in, shall we say, Pennsylvania very recently, and also in Wisconsin the other day. They can be delivered to a person's mailbox and stolen. They can be used by unscrupulous people to coerce or intimidate spouses, employees, relatives, neighbors to vote a certain way. They can, in nursing homes, be used to coerce or intimidate or convince people who are very weak and vulnerable to vote a certain way. And by the way, this is not just an artificial fear. Pennsylvania has the unusual distinction of, in recent years, there have been two former Democratic congressmen, Austin Murphy from the western part of the state near Pittsburgh and Ozzie Myers from Philadelphia, who actually have been indicted for illegally trying to convince people to vote a certain way. Austin Murphy near Pittsburgh would go into nursing homes and Alzheimer's patients' homes and basically help people fill out their ballots. He was convicted of that crime. Ozzie Myers was only recently indicted. He previously served time in public housing in Philadelphia for the Abscam scandal. Now, as a political consultant, he's indicted for voter fraud. So if former members of Congress, who you presume would have a reputation to uphold, are willing to actually go down in the dirty and do this, who else is willing to take that kind of risk? That's why we need safeguards and procedures that protect against fraud. And here is where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has been so disappointing. As we know, there was a partisan turnover in 2015 in Pennsylvania. The court moved from a conservative direction into a very liberal direction. And sadly, it's not really an issue of party, it's an issue of ideology. The people who now dominate the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania are radicals. They are judicial activists. They are willing to literally make up law. And let me give you an example of that. In the decision last Thursday, there is no provision anywhere in Pennsylvania election law that allows drop boxes to be set up to collect ballots. It just isn't referenced. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided that because of COVID and because of the fear of disenfranchisement, they were going to allow drop boxes. This is astonishing. It is literally made up law. And what are we seeing? Well, we saw a little bit of this in the primary in Pennsylvania early this year, where some election officials in Philadelphia were setting up mobile drop boxes. The Committee of 70 was deputizing themselves to go follow these mobile drop boxes around and help election officials to work the polls, the mobile polls. Votes on wheels, they called it. Well, here's the problem. These drop boxes are being scattered all over Philadelphia. They're not being scattered all over the state, both because county election boards decide they're not needed, or if they are needed, they'll just have one outside a courthouse with a sheriff's deputy watching it all the time. But these drop boxes that are being created all over Philadelphia, why are they doing this? Well, a few weeks ago, the Philadelphia City Council had an emergency meeting, literally called out of the blue the day before it was held. It lasted 5 minutes. And what was the purpose of this emergency meeting? It was to accept a $10.5 million grant from two very liberal foundations that had not been active in the election area before. And the $10.5 million grant was going to go to the Philadelphia Election Administration. But the Philadelphia Election Administration, in turn, had to agree that they were going to earmark this money, direct this money to causes and procedures that were supported by these foundations. And one of them, of course, was drop boxes. And another was to basically facilitate the early counting of ballots and various other measures. This is an outrageous abuse. Imagine if a private corporation were allowed to contribute money to a government enforcement agency and say, here's $10 million. We really would like to improve your enforcement procedures. We'd like to improve the way that you scrutinize our industry. And we have some suggestions for you. And all you have to do is sign this paperwork, and you can have $10 million to hire more people. Outrageous. Well, that's what's happening. And there's going to be a mobile drop box in Philadelphia. There'll be drop boxes all over Philadelphia. And as we know, Philadelphia has a storied history of voter fraud. There have been elections in which more people have voted in Philadelphia than the census found were adults over the age of 18. There have been elections in which more people have voted than there are even registered voters in some precincts. So this is fraught with peril. Now, what else did the Pennsylvania Supreme Court do? It did the following. It announced that, again, contrary to election law, they were going to extend the period of time after Election Day in which ballots would be counted if they were sent through the mail or left in drop boxes or delivered. They were going to extend it till the end of Friday, 3 days after the election. And for mail votes, and this is almost unprecedented anywhere in America, they were going to say, well, postmarks are not required on any ballots that are received up until Friday after Election Day. Not required. In fact, they have to be counted unless there is a clear preponderance of the evidence that the ballot was mailed after Election Day. Otherwise, they're going to be counted. Well, you can imagine the potential for mischief this creates. Pennsylvania, as you know, was very close. 1% of the vote for president and U.S. senator for Senator Toomey's election last time. And all you have to imagine is on election night, certain people figure out how many votes they need to get over the finish line. And on Wednesday morning, some ballots are manufactured. Remember the old saying in politics, if you don't have a natural majority in the electorate, you create a new majority. And the word create can be extremely creative. You literally can come up with votes out of thin air. So all of this is an extremely dangerous situation. Now, the good news is there was one dissenter on the Supreme Court, a Democrat. So the vote ultimately was 4-3, even though the Democrats have a 5-2 majority on the court. And in his dissent, he said, I've rarely seen a case in which there's a better argument to be made for an appeal to the Supreme Court for relief, for a stay or a delay in the implementation of this rule, which, as we know, is being done just a few weeks before the election, which is highly unusual and highly irregular. So this will be appealed to the Supreme Court. I believe that it will be getting expedited treatment, and so there's a chance it's overturned. But this just goes to show what the stakes are in Pennsylvania. Now, moving on beyond Pennsylvania, at least you don't have ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting, which has become extremely popular in California, where I'm from, is where you allow people to collect ballots from other people who are not their relatives and then scoop them up, and they can be paid campaign volunteers or officials who do this for a campaign, and then they collect them and bundle them and deliver them to the election offices. And this, of course, is also fraught with peril because you can have envelopes steamed open and ballots that go the wrong way, or ballots from neighborhoods that are going against the party of the person who is collecting the ballots suddenly get lost. You can have ballots filled out by someone who's intimidating someone else to vote a certain way. And ballot harvesting is considered very, very dangerous. And to the credit of a few Democrats, there are some who still speak out against this. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, whom you might remember was a presidential candidate in the Democratic primaries, has just become the lead co-sponsor of a bill that would bar federal election assistance funding to any state that legalizes ballot harvesting. She says it is an open and engraved invitation to fraud, and our election system's integrity is already under assault. There's a video that's up on her website, which I urge you to look. It's very compelling. So there are some honest Democrats who are speaking out on this. And again, I just want to close with a reminder that this is not a partisan issue. This is really an issue that should affect all of us, because if we lose confidence in the integrity of our elections, we not only embitter people and create more and more tensions in an increasingly polarized environment, but we also undermine confidence in our democracy. And the Supreme Court a few years ago in an Arizona ballot case said unanimously, the reason that we must have guardrails against manipulation, interference, and voter fraud is not just to prevent the fraud, but to make sure that people have confidence in the honesty and integrity and fairness of the election. Because if they lose that confidence, we lose the essence of our democracy. And again, you know, human nature being what it is, the lust for power being what it is, this is not an issue that is strictly partisan. Philadelphia used to be run by a Republican machine until the 1950s, and they committed voter fraud when elections were close. And in the 1950s, there was a sea change, and the Democrats took over the machine. And they took over the machine, and they found all of these tools available to them to manipulate the election and pad the electoral count. And they proceeded to not only adopt all of them rather than reform them, but to improve upon them and to make them far more sophisticated. And that's where we are now. We have political machines in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and even some in smaller cities, that if the election is close, people will bend the rules and break them. Now, one piece of good news, and I'll close with this. Election fraud is very much like shoplifting. If you go to a retail expert, he'll tell you that if a retail store does three things, put up a camera even if you don't have anyone watching it, have a security guard even if that guard is half asleep, and put up a sign that says shoplifters will be prosecuted, you will cut shoplifting 35 or 40%. Because there are a lot of people in our country who will do something if there's zero risk involved, if they think there's no chance anyone is looking. There are a lot of people who will not do something if there's even the slightest risk, if they think someone might be watching or they think their activities could be uncovered. Well, the same with voter fraud. And the U.S. attorneys in Pennsylvania have been active in this, both in Philadelphia and in the Western District around Pittsburgh, and they're sending out press releases saying that someone is watching this year. Someone will be paying attention. And all of us, whether we're poll watchers or poll workers or election officials at the polls, can also play a role in that. And if we make this an issue, and if we rebut the left's charges that there is no voter fraud, because emphatically there is, and just go to the Heritage Foundation's website and you'll find a catalog of over 1,300 recent cases of people convicted, not just indicted, of voter fraud, then we can have an election which is freer and fairer. And with some luck, before the Supreme Court, some of these more egregious actions by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania can be swept away. And with that, I will just hope that we have a spirited election contest which actually involves issues, and that ultimately this election is decided by the people and not, as I fear, by lawsuits that will ask judges to decide how the people voted. Thank you.